Thank you folks for coming to this series of meetings that we're having to give the public, the general public, the levee update on the Freeport Hurricane Levee System. My name is George Kidwell. I'm the chairman of the Velasco Drainage District Board of Supervisors. And we've been given a series of updates on the condition of the levees relative to an $80 million bond issue bond election that we've called for November the 5th. Just for some of you that are not real familiar with what the levee system is, Velasco Drainage District is the local sponsor for the federal levee system titled the Freeport and Vicinity Hurricane Levee Flood Protection System. This includes 44 miles of levees, pump stations, tidal gate, and different various drainage structures. The Corps of Engineers accepted this system into the federal system as a federal levee after Carla in 1961. And in 1965, they stood up a $42 million project to upgrade the levee system. Now during Carla, the surge did not breach or overtop the levee, but it did go around the end of the levee where the levee stopped about a half a mile west of the city of Oyster Creek. And so the Corps of Engineers basically extended that levee and upgraded it for $42 million. And the Velasco Drainage District actually was a shared sponsor, and we paid about $13 million of that $40 million to upgrade that project. Another thing that I think is pertinent is that the levee condition and design has not changed and has been in compliance until the standard changed post-Katrina in 2005. That's basically said that the levee hasn't deteriorated or changed from what it was. It's just that the standards have changed relative to what happened in New Orleans in 2005. Now here's an overview. It's an aerial view, and we've got the different reaches of the levee denoted in color, primarily so that when we talk about it with the Corps of Engineers and everybody, we all know which reach we're talking about. And if you look on the little left-hand side, you'll see the overview of Dow Chemical Plant B that's along the river, sort of in light red. And basically the levee comes down the river on the south, comes down to the Department of Energy storage area, oil storage area, goes across the front, which is sort of a purple line down there, over to the yellow line, and the yellow line goes around the port of Freeport, and then as it goes around the end there, it comes up in toward Freeport on the old river and reaches the tidal gate. And then on the north side of that tidal gate, then you have the green reach, which is around what we call the Dow Thumb, which goes around the Dow Thumb and out toward the jetties. And then at the jetties, we pick up what's normally called the Dow Barge Canal. This was a barge canal that was dredged during World War II when Dow came down here to bring seawater into Plant B for processed water and to allow barges with raw materials to come in to Plant B, which means that pink and blue that comes all the way into Plant B and then back out to the jetties is about 4 miles inland, about 8 miles of levee, and that's what we call the Barge Canal Levee. And you'll hear me talk about the Barge Canal Levee, and that's the area that I'm talking about. Then you see the blue that sort of goes due north and south. That's what we call our frontal levee. It's behind Surfside. And you can see we pick up the Barge Canal Levee there and go due north, cross 332, and then we go up to where we touch and reach Oyster Creek. And then we take the green line, goes up Oyster Creek, and it takes the levee up across to Oyster Creek 523, comes up and hits the blue line, which goes up and ties into the high bank of Oyster Creek up behind Clute, or behind what we call Lake Barbara. And that's the federal levee system. That's the coastal levee that protects from the hurricane surge. Now there's another levee system, we call it the riverine levee system, which picks up behind Dow on the river behind Plant B, and it basically goes up the river behind Lake Jackson, behind McLean Park, over across 2004 behind the Girl Scout cabin, and comes up and ties back in to Oyster Creek, where the Dow pump station is, just north of the mall, across 2004. And that closes off the upper end of that horseshoe, along with the high bank of Oyster Creek, from Oyster Creek there where it crosses 2004 down to the bank of Oyster Creek there behind Lake Barber, and that closes off that end of the horseshoe. Give you just a brief timeline. I'll try to not take much time doing this, but this all started back in early 2000 when Congress authorized FEMA to redo the national flood map system in the whole United States. They authorized about $3 billion to do that. Bring it up digital and put it into the electronic age and get away from the paper maps. They came to Brazoria County in late 2004, 2005, and basically said that they were there to redo the flood map in Brazoria County. The funding from Congress didn't give them any money to do watershed studies, so they asked for all the drainage districts and the county and the cities in Brazoria County to give them all the studies they'd done on any of the watersheds. And that would include Bastrop, Oyster Creek, Chocolate Bayou, anything we had on the river, and any drainage study that any drainage district or city had done for their local area. We gave that to them, and then came 2005, and we had, as most of you know, you're probably familiar with the storms of Katrina and Rita that occurred over New Orleans and on the Sabine and Neches rivers with Rita. And that really changed things. And what that really did, the impact it had, was really both FEMA and the Corps of Engineers. And USACE, by the way, I didn't tell you this at first, it's the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And what that did is, because of what happened over in New Orleans, they brought about more stringent standards for various things, design, stability, and all the technical things that went on. They found there were some deficiencies there. So they sort of beefed up their standards. And then FEMA sort of woke up and said, gracious, if we got to do that, we need to certify these levees with a professional engineer. And so basically they put out a policy called Memorandum 34 that said, certify the levees with a professional engineer or we're going to remove them from the flood maps. It's called the no levee policy, if you probably read about that in the paper. Between 2006 and 2009, about 3.5 years or so, we met with FEMA and the Corps of Engineers to sort of figure out how we were going to get them certified, who was certifying, where was the funding coming from, and what was the extent that we had to do, what kind of thing did we have to go through to get these things certified. With almost no results from either the Corps or FEMA, we finally decided we were going to have to sort of put our boots on and do it ourselves. So in 2010 to 2013, we did the following. First thing that we did, we retained a consultant, or you might call one a lobbyist, to help us figure out what we needed to do in Washington, D.C. with both FEMA and the Corps of Engineers to see what we could do to get this done. We made 4 trips to Washington, D.C. We authorized $5 million out of our capital contingency fund to evaluate the levee, and what that really amounted to is we went and drilled about 300 holes, core borings in the levee, did geotech work, evaluated the deficiencies, and basically tried to come up with a plan to fix the deficiencies, how much it would cost, and was there solutions to those problems. In March 2011, FEMA dropped the no levee policy that I mentioned earlier. Basically, the National Levee Alliance, of which we're a member, basically got Congress to write letters to FEMA and said the no levee policy was sort of stupid. You're going to say the levee is not on the flood map, you're going to put a flood zone behind it, but the levee's still there. So Congress asked them to develop some kind of risk assessment policy behind the levees and take into account if they were deficient. So FEMA agreed to do that, and they have since been working on a model-based risk assessment that we basically call LAMP. It's a levee analysis method procedure, and mapping procedure. And so that's in the mill, and therefore we don't have the no levee policy. But What that little move did is Congress also told FEMA that they could not release any more flood maps that had levees in them until this model-based risk assessment was completed and accepted by Congress. And so there were 280 flood maps frozen. Brazoria County was one of those areas that had the flood maps frozen. So for about 3 years, no flood map has been published in Brazoria County, and no new flood map. November 12, the results of our $5 million study confirmed that we had levee deficiency, and it gave us sufficient information to know where the deficiency were, to what extent they existed, and what the fixes would likely be, and how much money that might cost for us to do that so that we could certify the levees. This is a picture, and you won't be able to read the little yellow marks all over there on the right-hand side, but basically that's what we call the storm surge elevation results from FEMA, where they developed a program with the Corps of Engineers to tell us what the surge level would be as it approached our levee. The red line, vertical line, is basically the levee, and that's the frontal levee, and going across 332 there at the bottom. And this is a little bit better picture. We took a cross section of that, and you can see that that flood elevation there is about 14 foot against the levee, and you can see the cross section where we've got it marked is the elevation of the levee is 20.85 feet. So that says you got an elevation of about 14 and 20.5, so you got about 6.8 feet of freeboard relative to the storm elevation. Now what's critical about that does not include what we call wave run-up, or it does not include the waves that are brought about on top of that storm elevation. Well, FEMA calculates that. Now you can't read this probably from where you're sitting, but pay attention to the little pink boxes. And I'll direct your attention to the upper right-hand side where that little pink box is, and you can't read it, but the top number is 22.2. That means that surge elevation plus waves is 22.2 feet. And the crest, which is a little number below it, says it's 21.4 feet. And what that pink means is that the wave run-up plus surge elevation will go over the top of the levees. So every place you see a little red square box, FEMA says we got elevation problems. Well, the difficulty with that is, you remember I said that the surge elevation was 14 feet out there in front of that frontal levee. And if you do the topo, the land out there is about 2.5 feet. And if you got 14-foot surge elevation, that says you got about 11.5 feet of water out there in front of the levee. And FEMA has calculated a wave that's 8.2 feet deep. So what that's saying is they've got 8.2-foot wave and 11 feet of water. If you go back into all the calculations, that's hardly possible. So we've contested FEMA's data on that, and we're still working with the Corps and FEMA to resolve those issues. But in essence, as a result of some of our study, we've had a program designed by academics out in California that basically reran those pink boxes in another program, and we get the typical 3.5 or 4 foot wave that the Corps and we have gotten in previous studies. So we'll continue that classification, but in essence we don't have an elevation problem. We basically got some stability problems. The Corps of Engineers, because we're in the federal system, do an annual and what we call a periodic inspection every 5 years. And the most recent inspection, they rated our levee unacceptable. First time we've ever had an unacceptable rating by the Corps. Primary cause is that there is shallow and deep slope stability along with potential underseepage. Shallow slope stability, you've all probably seen driving down the road where along a drainage ditch or something, it looks like the slope has fallen off. Basically, shallow slope is that you get the water up on the slope doing some kind of a flood stage or flood event. It soaks in, and when the water drops quickly, there's so much weight on the soil from the water soaking into it that the shear strength of the soil doesn't have enough strength to hold it, and it falls off in what we call shallow slope stability. That's on the barge canal primarily, because that barge canal, as you recall, I said it was dredged out of in 1942, 40 and 42, and basically that levee is made out of dredge spoil. As they dredged that channel, they basically didn't make a levee. They just put that dredge spoil up, stacked it up on the side, and it, as a result, it eventually become a levee. And it's just got a lot of sand in it, rather than made out of compacted clay. The other area we have a problem with is what we call deep slope stability, and that's out around the Dow thumb. Deep slope stability is a little different. It's not basically the slope failing, but it's basically the levee, because of the flood stage. At flood stage, it gets so much weight on it that it fails sort of in a circular fashion right down the center of the levee, and the bottom of it underneath just slides out into the river. It's called deep slope stability. That's primarily brought about because of the channel depth that has been dug at the port to allow deeper draft vessels into it, and it has caused the safety factor around the thumb to be marginal. Then we talk a little bit about potential underseepage. Underseepage is water that drains down through the bottom of the barge canal levee in this particular case, goes through the thin clay layer, gets into a sand strata that we found when we done all these core borings, and about 12-15 feet below the toe of the levee there's a sand wedge underneath all that that's about 30 feet deep, and water goes through the clay in the bottom of the barge canal, gets into the sand, then moves laterally, piping, we call that piping, moves laterally and moves underneath the levee and moves the sand, and when it dislocates that sand underneath the levee and sort of burps up on either side, then the levee fails vertically and just falls into the gap that's left. Happens all the time on the Mississippi River. They call it boils or piping, and so we have that potential that we're still investigating and probably will have to correct with one of our fixes that I'll mention here in a minute. We have 3 eye walls with questionable ability. We've corrected 2 of these already. Eye wall is just a vertical wall that's used to stop the flood. It has no base at the bottom. It has no cross section at the bottom, which we'd call an inverted T-wall. This is just a vertical wall, and it's basically you drive it so deep, and the flood that gets on the top of it, trying to move it and cantilever it one way or the other, pushes it, and it holds the flood back. We've got one over by the tidal gate that appears when they filled that back in and did the tidal gate. It appears that they didn't drive some of the piling deep enough to get down into the clay to hold it stable. The Corps is still working on that design check to check the design. We've done some extra core borings over there, and we'll get that and see what we have to do to fix that. The other thing that came up in all this is, even though it's been in the Corps' specifications for years, it never has been brought to our attention. They expect to have video documentation of all our concrete gate structures, whether they're underwater or above water, which means we've got a lot of discharge pipe and a lot of structures that basically we don't have any way to dry them out so we can get in there and take video documentation. So we're working with the Corps to develop some more creative ideas of non-destructive testing, underwater photograph, using professional divers and that kind of thing to satisfy this video documentation. But it's one of the issues that we got an unacceptable on. The other one is what we call encroachments, and that's very simply pipe going through the levee, on the levee, any kind of encroachment, vertical or horizontal. That is now a no-no, primarily because the fear of seepage down the circumference of the pipe and destabilizing the levee and causing it to fail. Here's the fix. Along the barge canal levee, on either one or both sides, we'll armor that such that we'll reduce and minimize the seepage into the levee so that we don't have what we call shallow slope stability. and I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. But basically there's about 8 miles of that, 4 miles on each of the levees that I showed you where they went up to Plant B and back, and we'll armor that. That's one of the fixes we'll do. The other fix is we'll install relief wells as needed on the barge canal for what this deficiency that I classified as under seepage. And basically what we'll do is drill relief wells on the protected side of those levees down into that sand layer, so that if the water does seep through the clay in the bottom of the barge canal and moves laterally into the sand layer, then the relief wells will relieve that pressure and burp out the top of the relief well on a little safety valve mechanism, and keep the sand from moving laterally, and therefore keep us from having that under seepage problem. That's used all the time on the Mississippi River. It's pretty well used. We just haven't had any experience with it down here. It does have a high maintenance cost because you need to be sure those relief wells function when they're needed, and that'll be in a storm. And there's a whole testing procedure that we're not familiar with, but we're reviewing. But that's the fix for the under seepage. Eyewall fix, when the Corps of Engineers completes its analysis on that one on the tidal gate, then we'll have to decide how and who fixes that. Here's a picture of the armor. This is up on the Harris Reservoir. Dow Chemical has installed that about 12 years. That's about a 12-year-old armoring. It's basically a membrane that you anchor at the bottom, anchor at the top, and then you pump it full of cement or grout of a specified amount and type. And basically it prevents the seepage of water into the levee. That's actually laid on top of an impermeable membrane, and keeps the water from seeping into the levee. One advantage of doing that, we won't have to mow the levee because grass doesn't grow on it, but we will have some maintenance on that because that deteriorates a little bit, and sometimes you have to go in and cut out one of those little pillow blocks and replace it, but it seems pretty functional. The Corps has used it. It's used a lot of places to line the ditches and stuff in the United States. So here's the cost of what we're trying to do. The current estimate for all this for the Velasco Drainage District is about $80 million. That's the amount we've asked for in our bond election for November the 5th. The Corps of Engineers cost is really unknown at this time because they've assumed responsibility for the deep slope stability over on the Dow Thumb. And that cost has not been generated, but we know that's pretty significant. There is industry cost. It's unknown. For instance, all the infrastructure on the levee, these pipes, any kind of structures, telephone poles, security fences, are all industry's infrastructure, and they're responsible for that. And industry locally, Dow, Phillips, BASF, have all committed to resolve their infrastructure issues, and they're busy working on the plan with us to do that. If the entire $80 million is used, here's what the cost to the voters will be. Basically, it costs about 8 cents per $100 of evaluation, and that's if you have no exemptions. Then that cost will be about $80 a year for a $100,000 property, and $160 a year for a $200,000 property. Now, of course, if you got exemptions, if you don't have any, then it's 80 and 160, just like I mentioned. If you have a homestead exemption, it'd be $64 and $128 a year. And if you're old like me or disabled and homestead, it'd be $0 for a $100,000 property and $48 for a $200,000 property. If you compare those numbers with the probable increase in insurance cost, if behind the levees there was some type of a base flood elevation where you had to build over, not only would you, the communities, have a very severe decrease in development and ability to build, because you'd have to build your house or your commercial property or your plant 2 feet above whatever that base flood elevation was. So for instance, if FEMA came in and said behind your deficient levees because you didn't fix them, there's a 5-foot base flood elevation behind there, then you'd have to build your house 7 feet above natural ground. or they would charge you an increase in your flood insurance. And currently nationwide, in New Orleans and up in New Jersey with Sandy, they're seeing insurance rates go from $400 a year to as high as $25,000 a year. I talked to a guy from New Jersey that came down here recently, and he was in Sandy, had a beach on the barrier islands, and he has to build his house 13 feet above the barrier island. And if he does, he can get $400 insurance, and if he doesn't, his insurance will be $24,000 a year. The only funding method we really have to do this size of a project is bonds voted on by the community. Therefore, we've called a bond election for November 5th of this year. Now, here's some of the consequences we need to talk about if we don't do this. First consequence is we need to comply with the Corps of Engineers' acceptable rating. We currently have the unacceptable rating, and if we fail to qualify as an acceptable, then under Public Law 8499, there will not be any funds in case of a major storm damage to the levee. The Corps currently has a program that we're in called SWIFT, System-Wide Improvement Framework, and we put together a plan to fix our deficiencies, tell them when we're going to do that, what the milestones are, where we're going to get the money, and if we stay on that plan, we continue to be in Public Law 8499 coverage, so that if a major storm comes in, damages the levee, then the Corps of Engineers under the federal system come in and repair that damage. And so we need to do that in order to comply. Otherwise, we'll lose the ability to qualify for 8499 funds. Second, we must certify the levee system for FEMA to maintain Zone X behind the levees, or we'll risk some level of assigned base flood elevation behind the levee with increased flood insurance costs that I mentioned previously. And third, if we don't do it, there will be significant restrictions on industrial, commercial, and residential development. It's just hard to build chemical plants and commercial properties in residential areas inland on stilts. And if we don't fix it, then the community, taxpayers behind the levees, will end up with long-term increased risk behind the levees, even with high insurance costs, if we don't fix them. The risk, well, first of all, we're concerned about public safety. Life is number one, property is number two, but we're mainly concerned about the public safety. Basically, this is our plea to you, is when there's a storm coming and we ask you to leave town, leave town. We may or may not be able to protect your property, but at least we want you to save your life. Risk is greater than historically accepted. As I mentioned, we've always thought that levees were in pretty good shape. We did know that the Barge Canal levee had some sand in it, but we did not know the exact extent of it, and we found out that there's more sand in it than clay. Therefore, we have to do something about the stability and the seepage on the Barge Canal levee. The risk management is a shared responsibility for all of us, including the industry, the local communities, the Velasco Drainage District, and the individual landowners, property owners. We have a shared responsibility to manage that risk, and our attempt to do that is to fix the levee so that we can be behind the levee that's in good shape and certified. That doesn't mean flooding won't happen. We're at the risk of Mother Nature, and all the risk flooding will vary with the size of the storms or the local rain event, and we'll just try to minimize the risks in doing that, but it's not to say that it won't ever happen. Levees reduce the risk of flooding. Please remember that. It doesn't guarantee that there won't be flooding. It is a reduction of risk, and that's the intent to do that. And all the actions taken by all of us will end up saving lives and property. Now let me break in here just for a minute, because this is a recent occurrence, and I'll talk a little bit about flood mapping. I mentioned the rise in insurance costs, and you remember I told you early on that Brazoria County had been one of the 280 programs, flood mapping programs, that had been frozen in the United States, and there had been no flood maps published. And so we've been waiting basically to see how that all played out. Well, this new flood mapping procedure called LAMP that I mentioned, which is the model-based risk reduction program that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. We got a call in August, about the middle of August. We got a call from FEMA and said they had a proposal for Brazoria County. And what FEMA has done, since none of the flood maps are basically complete and they couldn't publish the flood maps in Brazoria County because of its lack of accreditation, FEMA had redone this levee analysis and mapping procedure called LAMP in response to the congressional request. And what they've done in FEMA is they've taken, out of those 280 projects, they've pulled 25 out as pilot projects. And the pilot project is basically to work with the local sponsors of the levee systems and go through this new revised LAMP system that were developed and see how well they work, so they can go back to Congress and tell Congress that they fulfill their commitment to design this new LAMP procedure. And Brazoria County is one of those 25 projects. They came to us in the middle of August. We have had our initial meeting with FEMA. They came down on the 17th of September. And basically what this is going to do is it will allow the local sponsor to work with FEMA and proceed with this LAMP process while we are waiting for the flood maps. And what this will do, it's called seclusion. And what they're going to do is they're going to pick the area that is protected by the levee, and this will include both the Angleton levee and the Freeport levee and the Riverine levee. The area that's protected by the levee will be secluded from the general publication of the flood maps. What that says is if the communities behind the levee will agree to this, it requires the concurrence of the impacted communities, then that area behind the levees will be secluded, and for insurance purposes, the current data on the 1989 flood maps will be held and frozen until we get through this process of working through the LAMP system. FEMA's estimate that'll take several years, and sort of the plan is for the rest of Brazoria County, then they'll produce the new flood maps in a preliminary stage, probably early next year sometime. It'll go through the appeal and comment process, and probably maybe as early as 2 years from now there'll be a new flood map for the rest of Brazoria County. But behind the levees, we'll be using the old flood map for insurance purposes. That's an advantage to us. We've been asking FEMA to give us some flexibility, give us time to fix the levees, and it looks like under this system FEMA might be allowing us somewhere between 3 to 5 years to work on our levees before they issue the new flood maps behind the levees. This is just a graphic to give you an idea of what they're talking about. The brown lined areas is the area behind the levee. On the lower one is the area behind the Freeport levee system. The upper one is the area behind the Angleton system. And we have not sat down and argued about the delineation of each of those lines, but that's the general format. And you can see all the blue area then is the rest of Brazoria County, and they'll have the new flood map data that's digitally put onto the computer, and those preliminary maps will be out maybe as early as next year, early next year. So that's basically the presentation. We'll answer your questions and have a discussion with those that are there representing the Velasco Drainage District and or the Bond Advisory Committee. If you have any question at all, call the Velasco Drainage District at 265-4251. We'll be glad to answer your question, come talk to you, and be sure you understand all this. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much.